In December 2011, Farming Smarter held its annual conference and trade show at the Lethbridge Lodge Hotel, bringing together over 250 agricultural professionals and over 20 speakers. The conference served to educate members of the farming community on growing trends, opportunities, and issues facing today's agricultural industry. We now take you to the Farming Smarter Conference to view the presentation of our speakers.
You know why we're here right now? We're here to present the Orville Yonke Award. It gives me great pleasure to present the Orville Yonke Award to this year's recipient. The purpose of this award is to recognize Southern Albertans who have made significant contributions toward the advancement of agriculture in Southern Alberta. In 2009, the first Orville Yonke Award was presented to Don Wentz, and in 2010 to Richard Fritzler. Both of these gentlemen have made huge contributions to agriculture, and I cannot think of any more deserving of the award than Don and Richard, along with this year's recipient, Ric Swihart. Ric Swihart is a Fort Macleod native who spent his summer vacations until the age of 17 on his grandparents' farms in southwestern Saskatchewan, and readily admits to this day of being able to close his eyes and smell the tilled farmland as vividly as when he drove tractor for his uncles. He also admits that minus the money and guts to farm, he writes about the men, women, and children that make up a most important, vibrant, and trying industry. That is why he created a diverse coverage concept. Yes, the politics of agriculture, both government and in industry, are important, but agriculture remains a people world, and those folks, because they produce the best quality, safest, and most nutritious food in the world, deserve to have their story told. He came a long way from the day the managing editor of the Lethbridge Herald called him into his office to tell him he was now in charge of agricultural coverage. Rick thought instinctively it was because he was the only reporter who knew the big tires go on the back of the tractor. Yes, you guessed it, Rick started his career at the Herald December 8th, 1969. Writing to make a difference is his slogan, printed boldly on the pens he readily disperses. And to that end, Rick has benefited from editors who recognize the importance of agriculture, that it truly is the #1 industry in Southern Alberta for sure. Working into his 42nd year, Rick spread the Southern Alberta farm story through various publications printed by the Herald, was a voice of agriculture for 10 years for CBC's Radio Noon Show, 10 years subsequently for Alberta Agriculture's Call of the Land, and in a partnership with the Herald about 3 years for 95.5 FM in Lethbridge. He wrote for 38 years for the Western Producer and more recently Alberta Farmer Express, in addition to numerous magazines. All that extra work was mainly to expand the story of agriculture from Southern Alberta and to wage the continuing fight to bridge the urban-rural communication gap. Rick is an honorary member of the Alberta Farm Writers Association and the Alberta Institute of Agrologists. He is also the first Canadian to be a member of the National Association of Agricultural Journalists in the United States. Rick and his wife Sharon reside in Lethbridge and along with their 5 grown children are actively involved in community activities. His passions, aside from agriculture, include his family, grandchildren, community and church activities, and woodworking. Please help me welcome Ric Swihart. Rick, on behalf of the Farming Smarter Conference Committee, I would like to present to you the 2011 Orville Yonke Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Agriculture and Conservation in Southern Alberta. And you can't take that home, I guess, so here's one to put on the wall, Rick. Rick is going to do a presentation on a look back on 30 years in ag media. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be asked to do this. I'm usually on the other end of the pen and the camera, but somebody said I might have something to say, so I really appreciate the opportunity. Kind of like Jean Chrétien one time, he was asked to go to London, England, to talk to the British Parliament and spent a full day there explaining what was happening in Canada. And so the Prime Minister of Britain said, "We have a surprise for you, Mr. Prime Minister of Canada. The Queen will show up at your hotel tonight in a big carriage and 4 matched horses, and she'll take you off to supper." Well, they were riding along, and a couple of those horses, their tails kind of took a new position, and some odor kind of infiltrated the carriage. And the Queen was quite flustered, and she says, "You know, Mr. Prime Minister, I have a lot of influence in this country, but there's some things I have no control over." And Jean said diplomatically, "Well, Your Highness, if you hadn't raised the issue, I would have blamed it on the horses." But journalism, 41 and a half years, probably 99% of that in agriculture. As space dwindled last 3 or 4 years, I've had to cover everything from funerals to weddings to potlucks but agriculture has been my love. And it all started when I was playing hockey in Fort Macleod, and no reports were getting done for the Macleod Gazette, so why not? You know, and it came easy, relatively, because education wasn't really easy for me. And great reaction from readers in the town that they'd like to see the local stories. And then maybe a high school job could turn into a career. Mount Royal College is my alma mater, and they had a career day at Fort Macleod with many others, and I went to the Armed Forces booth and then to Mount Royal. And they had just introduced their journalism program a year before. And my dad thought I was nuts. Nobody in the family had ever been involved in journalism. So I went off for 2 years to Mount Royal. I went 2 years to Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, came back with a degree and thought I knew a bunch. Lethbridge College then at that time, the community college in those days then had a new journalism or an agriculture program. And I went to the director of the day and said, maybe I should take a college course once a semester, and then I'll really know a whole bunch at the end. And then I thought, you know, then I would be thinking I know it all, and I wouldn't be a real reporter, which is a secretary for you folks, reporting what you folks are thinking and saying and doing. So anyway, I covered initially a lot of stuff. I covered the very first City of Lethbridge strike with the CUPE union, mostly because my desk mate got drunk one night and threw a typewriter out the window, and they lost their City Hall reporter. And so that was a nice thing. And as it was mentioned, the farm writer of the day fell in love in Nelson, BC on a Friday and quit on a Saturday, and so they handed me the job of agriculture. And I was to lay out the pages too, and Don Pilling says it's easy. A 36-point head, there's 11 characters in a column. Go to it. And so there was some pretty funny headlines for a while. It was the time when Bill C-176 was being brought in by the federal government. That's enabling legislation for marketing boards and commissions. So I read a couple of pieces in the Western Producer, and at that time the Winnipeg Free Press report on farming, and I wrote a column, and my golly, Sven Eriksson came in. If he'd have been a chicken, his feathers would have been really raised. It was madder than heck, and that netted me a meeting with then Ag Minister Bud Olson, who explained the issues from his perspective. And what it did is it told me that agriculture news is and can be very important from the government side. And then I learned over years of work that it is really important also to the farmers. And then this bridging the urban-rural gap, I think that's what hasn't happened yet, is the urban people realizing the same thing. I don't do this very often. I mean, drink water. Hey? But it showed me that while all these issues are important, agriculture really is about people. And I think that's a vital awareness that all of us in Canada, really the world, should grasp that without farmers, we can't eat. And if we can't eat, well, the story goes. So I just want to think of my career really as a series of highlights to expose agriculture and its strengths and its weaknesses to my reader world. Now, one was the potato industry was brand new to me. I remember going to the exhibition park one spring, and about 2,500 mostly northern Saskatchewan natives were getting out of all kinds of buses. They had arrived for a summer of labor in the sugar beet industry and the potato industry too. And they came to hoe and weed and thin the sugar beets and weed the potatoes and so on. And we talk about mechanical advances. Then came a mechanical thinner. It would run along a row, and there was a little sensor, and it would a blade would go flipping by like this, and it would take out a beet plant or two, and sometimes it would take out the good beet plant and so on. 2 years later, the farm industry, the beet industry introduced planting to stand. All of a sudden, they didn't need thin beets anymore because there was a beet every 7 or 10 inch or whatever they prescribed. So advances in agriculture provided lots of story material for me. And now, of course, GM beets. Man alive. I think it was Gary Tokariuk told me he had a wonderful stand, but he had some volunteer canola from the year before, which was GM canola. So he took his sons and maybe one daughter, they went and rogued the field and got rid of all that canola plant. And you look across the beet fields today, and it's like a tabletop. It's a beautiful sight. Artificial insemination in the cattle industry was booming, starting to boom when I started. And my first experience was in the dairy industry. He was a farmer out in Picture Butte area. He had, I think it was ABS is the name of the initials for the company. And it was a time when they were determining that by knowing the traits of a sire, they could match that semen with the weaknesses in a cow and come up with a better offspring. And manipulation, or whatever you call it, it was working. It's still being used in the dairy industry, and I think maybe somewhat more in the selective area, but insemination in the beef industry also. On the beef front, I think the feedlot industry really was born in southern Alberta. I remember Dick Gray. He was a member of the old 52 Maple Leaf team that won the World Hockey Championship. And he had his valley feeders right down here beneath the hill heading to the west side. I covered a lot of stories in that early development of the Alberta Cattle Commission, now the Alberta Beef Producers. A move to give producers really more input in their futures. And I think that was a good move. But when the original talk came about Alberta Cattle Commission, there were people out there saying, they're going to tell us things we have to do. They were afraid of it. And it turned out, because they had input, pretty lousy some years, there was more delegates than farmers coming to listen to them at many meetings, but it was the right move. It was an opportunity to give these farmers a say in their industry. Just glancing around this room and downstairs, some of those highlights, I look at Owen Cleland here, and it was men like his father, Walter, who created the dry bean industry initiative on the producer front. Elizabeth Tokariuk was downstairs, and she's serving several specialty crop sectors with secretarial work and so on. And her father, Steve Tokariuk, was a secretary of the sugar beet growers for years, and had lots of input with guys like Lolly Jensen and so on. And it was her husband, Gary, that was out roguing the field for canola, and he's now a member of the sugar beet board. The Helma family, Christine was downstairs on the deck. That's the daughter of Jack and a granddaughter of Harry, a great-granddaughter of Jacob. And here was a family that basically made a living on about 12 acres of vegetables. And I think Jacob had 40 acres total, and it was irrigated, so he'd grow a few acres of potatoes, a few acres of beets, a little hay, and then 12 acres of vegetables. And Jacob had 12 kids, so that was his labor pool. Harry had 5 kids, so that was his labor pool. And Jack has 5 or 6 kids. They're homeschooled. I was out there after school started, and his young boy was working like a Dickens. And he says, I'll learn this other stuff later. You look at the soft wheat industry in southern Alberta. It was developed, it was a big industry at one time, and it was designed to meet the flour milling industry for pastry and cookie flour mostly. And they got their commission going. It was doing well. Lately, it's been in trouble. The acreage are way down. And they had a checkoff thing. Of course, it was voluntary. But I think it was last year or the year before, the wheat board priced barley below or above the price of soft wheat. and a whole bunch of cattlemen bought a whole bunch of soft wheat and didn't pay the check off. And then all of a sudden the marketing board's in trouble. The commission's in trouble. Those are the kind of things. Now, irrigation. It's been a vital sector of southern Alberta for years. I got the chance to see the massive technological changes and the massive adoption of that technology by agricultural producers. It's always claimed to have about 20% of Alberta's food production on 4% of the arable land base. Irrigated agriculture really is that strong of an input. It's a value-added industry. It creates jobs all over the place. Without the Tabor sugar beet industry, you wouldn't have 130 jobs, permanent jobs in the factory. You wouldn't have another 100 jobs that go in the field. You wouldn't have a Kirshner as vibrant because of the manufacture of beet industry equipment. Irrigation wouldn't have a major client that can pay the bills. And it's just that important. So we came upon a little piece of land at Fort Macleod. One of my first goals was to put up a pivot. It was only 85 acres, but it's a funny piece of land, funny shaped piece of land. That was the biggest check I ever wrote in my life. And there's irrigation farmers out here that do that time after time after time. I don't know how they sleep at night, because they got confidence in themselves and their industry, that's why. And now with major water conservation advances, man, these irrigation districts have expanded their licensed area, and guys are taking up some of that land. And they're also giving land back to their communities, allocations of water that'll go to some of their industries outside of agriculture even. And the environmentalists are right in lots of ways, but I haven't seen any of them congratulate the irrigation industry for that move either. On the dryland front, I guess one of the biggest events in my career was the soil conservation movement. My wife her aunt was married to Shirley Noble with the Noble Cultivator fame, and so we got to know some of that. One of the real pioneers was Ike Lanier right here with Rod's father. I think Ike told me years ago that he parked his cultivator long ago. And in the southeast was Orville Yankee, of course, a marvel of a man. I went out to visit him one time, and he was quite ill at the time, but he took the time to show me around his farm and show me what dryland agriculture, conservation farming had done for him. And we went to a field, a canola stubble field, and the little winter wheat stubble was just coming up, and he says, it's late, but it's going to make it. And then he said he was convinced of the value of conservation farming, and he knew all about it. And he was really waiting until he could get a whole bunch of windmills on the perimeter of these little jetties out to the coulees. And he would have done it too, and it may come on that farm. But it wasn't really until a city fella came out with his little boy, and maybe the rest of the family, but Orville was taking the boy and the dad for a little circuit tour. And the little boy, naturally, I guess, lots of water and pop, he says, "Dad, I have to relieve myself." So Orville drove into a little field off the highway, or off the road, and let the boy out. And the boy came back and says, "Dad, I could not make a river." And Orville says, "Yes, that's what conservation farming is all about." With irrigation pivots mostly, you know. And then you stop and think of what conservation farming netted. The Alberta Wheat Pool jumped on the bandwagon and came out with the Conservation 2000 program, put its entire resources to the farm community and the conservation farming movement for 10 years. And to me, the most important part of that whole thing was the clutches of farmers and districts gathered together to talk about it. It wasn't some kingpin at a great big podium somewhere. It was farmers learning about it in their own areas. And then you hear somebody that bought more land because he could make it on conservation farming. Of course, that guy also got hell from one of the farm implement dealers because he bought a tractor in the United States over the internet. Oh gosh, I've had so many opportunities to listen and interview many important people. Chet Huntley was in Shelby, Montana one time, and I asked him what was probably the most emotional thing he had ever covered as a team with the Huntley-Brinkley television news team. He said it was when he went to the Snake River area. There was an internment camp for the Japanese in the west coast of the United States. And he said they went there, and these people they were put in makeshift H-huts, kind of like the Air Force would have in Canada. And he said they weren't ready to jump in the river. But a week or 2 weeks later, we went back, and they had curtains on the windows. They had gardens planted. They were hauling water by pail from the river, and it was their new life. And the same thing happened right here in southern Alberta. Now, I wasn't here at that particular time. I think it was still a gleam in Dad's eye yet, but I have experience with those people that went through that, and I think you'll agree with me that in this country also, some of those Japanese people have become and are some of the best citizens and some of the best farmers that we have in this area. The grain and beef sectors have been through ups and downs. I think the cattle industry is about an 11-year cycle, the hog industry about a 3-year cycle, and there's been ups and downs. And the exotic movement came in. And there was a Cardston operation with a consortium of guys sold a Simmental bull for $154,000 to a consortium of Oklahoma and Texas ranchers. The guy that was asked to truck the bull down there showed up in one of these little rental open, and he had 3 hay bales in it, and he was going to tether that bull in the back of this little trailer. Well, the guy from Oklahoma that came up to take possession said, no, this air-conditioned truck that you brought it to the border with will take it down to Oklahoma and Texas. And of course, that launched, as we all know, a huge change in the beef industry. And then there was a guy working for Alberta, the Canada Labour Pool at the post office and building, and he said, you write about these exotic cattle, you've really ticked my wife off. And I said, well, how so? Well, she came here from a middle European country, and she said when she arrived, she wasn't called an exotic, she was called a honky. And that wasn't very fair in her mind, but we got over that. Of course, BSE raised its head and industry suffered, but it also survived, thanks, I believe, mostly to the backbone of the producers in Canada. And the government came through with a little bit of help, too. On the grain front, it was the loss of the Crow's Nest Pass freight rate, and then the freight assistance and feed rate assistance, and then numerous challenges from the U.S. grain trade, and now ultimately the CWB battle won by the federal Tories. Makes one remember the failed continental barley market a few years ago, where Western farmers gained the right to ship their own barley to the U.S. The problem was simple. The American farmers circled their terminals and said, get lost. It was a show of support for their own markets. And I don't know how many of you knew Bill Arsini, but he was if he'd have been an inch taller, he'd have been square, and he was about that blunt, too. And he said, if American farmers ever tried to fill my elevator, I'd circle it, too. So he supported the American farmers in that move. So apparently the new grain world is here. There should be lots of story material for the news industry, I believe. One of the biggest stories should be the transparency issue on grain pricing and grain marketing. That's long been considered a fault of the Wheat Board by some. And I'm sure Cargill will open its books readily to everybody so they know exactly where their grain went and how much it was sold for and all that really neat stuff. All of that stuff was vital news coverage in my mind, and even exciting, perhaps even when the impact on producers was not the best. It was real. And the real pleasure came when I could visit farmers and ranchers and at times their children for human interest stories tied to the ag industry. I have often thought such a visit program for urban residents in some organized format would be the best way to bridge that rural-urban communication gap. It might help Alberta agriculture people realize the grass is not always greener on the other side, but it will also strengthen society's understanding or misunderstanding of the agriculture industry as a total, and I feel may actually level out the political influence field for this dwindling farm population in Canada. The other way, raised a few years ago, when the County of Lethbridge was meeting parents to explain a pending rural school closure, after some heated debate outside of town here, a county official said, well, ladies and gentlemen, student population is the issue here. We can't afford to run this school. All I can say is the next time the train runs through at 3 a.m., don't roll over and go back to sleep. Get us some more pupils here. So I've been blessed to have had a wonderful career in this field I love. One friend actually said that, personally, he said Rick loved his work so much that he couldn't retire because he really wasn't working. I do have to give thanks to my wife Sharon for the patience to allow me to fully meet my self-imposed responsibilities to cover agriculture as I saw fit, including all the lonely nights that I had to work to meet the daily deadlines for the paper of the day. So all I can say is thank you so much for this industry. Thank you for the years I was able to cover it, alternating medicine at to Lethbridge. I hope that the journalism industry will continue to recognize the importance of this sector. And in this blessed season, I ask for God's blessings on everybody in agriculture and to recognize the real reason for the season. Thank you very much.